All right, welcome back to Demo Auth0. Today we're exploring Fern. Fern helps companies deliver SDKs and API documentation that they are proud to share with their customers. I would like to welcome the co-founders of Fern, Danny and Deep. I love the coordination there.
Freya, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I'm Danny, one of the co-founders here at Fern.
And I'm Deep, another co-founder at Fern.
Thank you so much for being here. Could you tell us a little bit about what you both do at Fern?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, we're Auth0 customers, but we have to mention it. It's our authentication experience. But at Fern, I help companies evaluate whether we're a fit for their problems. Typically, these companies have a public API and they find it frictionful for developers to integrate. And that's typically the problem that they'll come talk to me about. Deep, how about you?
Yeah, at Fern, I help customers get live with their SDKs, so our customers are really obsessed with developer experience. They want their docs to look pixel perfect. They want their SDKs to really represent their product in the best way. And so we spend a lot of time iterating with them to really get to the perfect output so that they feel proud of the SDKs and docs that they give their customers.
I love it. I think I can tell that you're very passionate about developer experience. So we're going to get a chance to talk about that. But could you first start by telling us a little bit about your story, how Fern started and how it's evolved over time?
Yeah, we have the privilege of getting to go to bigger technology companies before starting a business. So Deep and I met at college at the University of Michigan. After that, Deep went to Palantir, where he was there for 4 years. I went over to Amazon and AWS, where I was there 3 years. And one of the insights is that both Amazon and Palantir had built internal tooling to generate SDKs. And they did that to make APIs easier to use. At Amazon, it was mostly geared towards public APIs, literally for S3 and EC2 and DynamoDB. At Palantir, it was more about microservice to microservice interaction in a type-safe way. One of the insights that we found is if Amazon and Palantir built their own internal tooling, they staffed engineering teams to do it. Might anyone else have? And then we found that Stripe and Dropbox and Twilio had all built SDK generator tooling internally. And that's when the light bulb went off. And Deep and I said, if big companies are able to go spin up engineering teams to solve a problem, what if we built a generalized solution and sold it to the market? And at that time, you have no idea about what market size is. I think Deep and I kind of chuckle when some of the venture capitalists ask, what is your total addressable market? The answer is, I'm not sure. We're going to start building and figure it out.
I love it. How do you compare what Fern does to like the more traditional methods in terms of the developer experience?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. I think like the original method for, API consumption was that, hey, I have a developer, they're going to like write out an API, then you're going to go message that developer, on some messaging platform, hey, what data do you take in? What data do you take out? And then like that probably was like the dominant way of distributing APIs, probably in like late 90s, early 2000s of like the internet boom. And then over time, like when Stripe entered and API first businesses became a thing, that's when people were like, hey, it actually makes sense to hire 4 or 5 people that are devoted to documentation and devoted to SDKs so that we can give our customers a great experience. What we are doing now is that every single company can't afford to hire that many engineers and just staff them on both SDKs and documentation. So we're taking that and we're making it available to every other company at like much lower cost, right? With Fern, you just take your OpenAPI or you take your API definition, you pass it in, and then boom, you'll get these documentation and SDKs automatically generated.
Freya, this kind of reminds me of the Auth0 story in some sense.
Yeah, honestly, I think that there's a lot of overlap in terms of how Fern and how Auth0, when we started and today, treat developer experience and how we want developers to automate processes to really make sure that they can focus on their main jobs, which I know you can say for pretty much any dev tool, right? The end goal is to make everyone's job easier. But I know you've had an interesting conversation with some folks at Auth0 about how our stories are very aligned. Would you want to share a little bit about that?
I would love to. One of the things that I got to learn about the Auth0 story, and this was with Eugenio, one of the founders and CEO of Auth0.
One of the best people to talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, talk about primary source. What he shared with me is that Auth0 one decided to take something that was being recreated at a lot of companies and build it as a service.
Mhm.
So it's like the idea that you have a user, that user might belong to an organization, that organization or that user might have scopes or roles. These are ideas that every software application kind of needs, but everyone should have to build themselves. So a company like Fern, we got to join the Auth0 startups program and actually get it free for a whole year, which was pretty amazing. We didn't have to rebuild a lot. We could just focus on building core product. But something that about Auth0 that stands out for me is that early on, when Deep mentioned staffing a team on Docs and SDK, and Eugenio said that every year he would get pressure to reduce the size of the docs or the developer tools, I believe is what it was called, which include SDKs, even things like a Terraform provider or a command line interface. There are other things that can fall into this category of developer tools. Every year there was pressure to reduce headcount to go build other products. And he defended that headcount within Auth0. And the reason is he prioritized frictionless developer experience and onboarding.
Yeah.
And what happens when you prioritize that? It becomes a strategic advantage. And I think we see companies like Stripe, Auth0, Twilio, they built reputations for being the developer-friendly tool. And developers were actually the champions and the advocate within an organization that would go buy and bring in that tool.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that that area of documentation and developer experience is also where it's very difficult to put metrics and to measure and say that this area needs a lot of investment. However, you do end up seeing that those areas are obviously going to be the most valuable because that's literally your target audience. So I'm glad that you had a chance to speak to Eugenio and you could like bring that to us as well. Speaking of your experience with Auth0 and in the startups program, how did you decide to use Auth0 and what were some of your security requirements that led you to building with us?
That's a great question. It's extra topical. So actually within the first, I think, month or second month of starting Fern, we had to pick like, hey, we want an authentication provider. We need our users to log in. We need our users to only be able to generate SDKs for their own organization, not somebody else's organization. And so we were checking out a couple different auth providers. At the time, I had maybe like 4 or 5 years of experience in Java. So the key thing for me was like, hey, I need a Java SDK so that I can get started up and running. So we surveyed all these
Was that really a requirement?
For me, it was because
Yeah.
I didn't want to go write it. So, like these APIs that Auth0 offers or some of these other competitors out there, they're quite large and it does take a little bit of it does take effort to integrate with them. And I wanted to get that work done as fast as possible so I could put my energy into building features for Fern. So it was actually a very easy decision for us. We looked at these platforms, we asked them what languages, what SDKs do you support? Auth0 was one of the only ones that had a Java SDK, and then our decision was made. And the remarkable thing was, like at that moment, we didn't realize like how much of a vendor dependency we were taking on. Because once you integrate with an auth provider, it's really hard to now pick another auth provider. And so even though, like it's really hard to say like, hey, the SDKs, are they really earning us money? In this anecdote specifically, not only did Auth0 get a user, but you got a really sticky user that's going to stay around for quite some time.
Yeah, and that makes sense. Did you ever consider building something in-house, or what are some of the other things that you were considering before you decided to integrate with Auth0?
We didn't consider building in-house because we knew we wanted to support authentication with all the different, identity providers out there. So we wanted GitHub, Google. We thought eventually we want the whole long list, and it just did not make sense for us to even invest an hour in building any of this functionality on our own. We were so focused on, hey, are we building a product that can get to product market fit? And so we were like, let's use a vendor, let's get it done as fast as possible, and then let's see who we can which customers can we solve the problem for? That's where our entire focus was.
I think one of the keys here, Shreya, is that Deep, as the engineer on the project in this case, made the buying decision for the organization for probably the next decade.
Yeah.
In the first experimental prototype, first month of project stage.
Exactly. Because he's the one who has to make that decision for future engineers to follow as well, right? Like he's not just basing it on just like a price or like a number alone, but specifically saying it's easier to use, it's quicker to implement, and it's going to be a better long-term solution for your team. Something that you're not going to have to rip out.
When it's time to enable SSO, it's going to be a couple of clicks.
Exactly. Yeah. So what does your authentication experience look like today?
Yep. So today, Fern is a CLI tool. We want to meet developers right where they are. So we integrate directly, into their terminal in GitHub Actions, wherever they're running SDK generation and documentation generation. So when a user wants to log into Fern, they just download the Fern CLI, which is npm install Fern API, and then they run a command Fern login. At that moment, the user, Auth0 page pops up. The user has to log in via GitHub, and they're assigned an organization. And once they are assigned an organization, they get certain roles and abilities. For example, I can generate a documentation page for my organization, but I can't do that for someone else. And the same thing with SDKs.
Awesome. And can you tell me a little bit more about what this organization structure looks like? I'm a big fan of like B2B systems and multi-tenancy and everything. So I'm curious about how you've set it up.
Yep. So the organization in our case is one-to-one with a customer. And so, one of our customers, Cohere, they would have a single organization inside of our Auth0 tenant. And then within that Auth0 tenant, there would be multiple members with different roles and privileges. Some people who can generate docs, some people who can't and who can only view. And everything kind of revolves around that organization primitive.
That's
and what's
awesome.
nice is that as we add more identity providers, it doesn't matter. We can take all those users and still affiliate them with that single org.
Gotcha. And now switching gears a little bit away from Auth0, but talking more about what your product looks like. Danny, you said something about agent experience when we were talking about this previously. Could you define agent experience or agentic experience in the context of API development?
Absolutely. I think it probably makes sense to talk about evolution.
Mm-hmm.
We can start with developer experience, which is how Auth0 planted its flag in the ground of outstanding developer tool. For developer experience, it's a human that's going to be interacting typically with your API service, and they want to do things like generate an API key, create an account, make a test API call, then make a production API call. So those are the things that the developer cares about. They typically are going to be reading documentation and want it to look pretty and want a nice interactive HTML website. We move from developer experience to just, let's talk about like bots. Bots where I can call an API, but I can only do it in a very rule-based programmatic way. And that is something we've had robotic process automation, RPA, for a long time. Yeah. And the idea is I want to go use this API call to go perform an action. So those are the two pillars that we've had, are humans and bots using APIs. We are now seeing a new trend led by tools like Lovable and Bolt.new and Replit and V0 by Vercel. And what these tools are allowing is actually in this case, it's an agent, which you can think about as an LLM powered software, can actually make a decision and have a probabilistic outcome for what API should be used. What do I mean by that? I want it to go set me up an Auth0 account without actually going in and clicking login. I want the tool, let's say I'm using Cursor. I want Cursor as my IDE to go be able to create me an Auth0 account. I want it to go find me the API key, and then I want it to go create a test organization. And I want to do that from just prompting. What API calls is it going to need to make? in the world of agents, we're seeing the most common interaction for APIs being the Model Context Protocol server, MCP server. This is an open protocol that was proposed by Anthropic. It is exciting to us, the speed of adoption. I would say it seems like 0% in production today. It seems 100% experimental. And Deep, I would love your thoughts on that. It doesn't feel like any of our customers or their end users are building these agentic workflows right now into production, but it feels like there's a very high amount of experimentation happening.
Yeah, 100%. I'd agree with that. I think there's a lot of excitement in the space and the demos are really cool. You know, like you can open up Replit and then suddenly you have a Supabase account and you're just building your application without ever having to log into Supabase. So the applications here are really cool, but there's still a lot of challenges to figure out, like, how is the agent authenticating with my API? Does the agent have different types of permissions than my user does? You know, and so all these questions, I think the community will have to figure out an answer. But it's exciting because we're seeing another type of user, not developers, emerge as a consumer of these APIs.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is very timely for us as well. We have been working on an auth for Gen AI concept. So, really, like, what can we do to help all of these demos go to production so that they're secure? And as the users are using these agents, they know that they're using an experience that's not going to end up like the agents aren't going to end up taking control and making decisions on their behalf without the right permissions first. And so, we're excited to be launching something related to that soon. But obviously,
Did we get to learn more today?
I wish, I really wish I could share more. Hopefully, by the time this video is actually coming out, we'll have more and maybe we can add it post production.
Cool.
But it's cool because I normally always ask, like, oh, what's the impact of developer experience on these type of experiences? But it's like obvious, like you don't even have to talk about how much easier life is going to be when you don't have to go and pull all of these access tokens and make all of these API calls by yourself. What are some of the challenges that you're facing when you're designing a system that integrates, the traditional developer experience with a more agentic experience?
Yeah, it's interesting because it challenges a lot of assumptions at the core. I'll give you a very simple example. So we spent a lot of time in our documentation product, you know, like making it pixel perfect. Like, hey, how does this card look? How does the API playground look? Do these colors look exactly like a user may want? And the ROI on that for a human developer is actually pretty high. You know, it does make it pretty easy for a human developer to like understand these concepts when the design is really high. But for an agent, it actually just doesn't matter at all, right? Like these agents are just consuming text entirely as their medium. And so when we went back, it's like we kind of almost had to, you know, quote unquote, fork our product, and we offer something called an LLMs.txt, where we just take all the markdown documentation and just kind of like dump it in a text file. And so we effectively have two docs, you know, like one for humans and one for agents. And
Well,
so it's almost like we're building two products.
let's take a look at this right now.
Yeah,
Shreya, can you see my screen?
that's the perfect segue. Yeah, let's go for it.
Here's one of our customers, 11 Labs. They're a voice AI company. For their documentation, they've chose to build it with Fern. This is all really pretty, but like an LLM, an agent, has no care in the world for a pretty animation. It's just distracting. Same with the JavaScript pop-up that you can talk to their support team in a programmatic way. Instead, by appending this LLMs.txt, we load a text file. This is very similar to sitemap.xml, which was built for the crawlers from search engines. But in this case, it's listing out every page that they have, the title of the page, and then a link. But what's in that link? It's actually not a link to the page. It's a link to the markdown that backs the page, which is fed into the context window. So the idea here is that I could ask Claude or I could ask ChatGPT or Perplexity, go ahead and learn about 11 Labs product. I can just pop in this link, copy, paste, and then it could understand that maybe I'm talking about stitching together multiple requests, and the LLM, the actual agentic process, will go and grab this specific file And so what this allows, what Deep was mentioning is that agents do not want to see very pretty HTML and a lot of fluff on the page like a human. They want to get more down to the actual text file, or in this case, markdown file.
So while we're here screen sharing, the next thing that we were going to do is actually ask you for a demo of the product so we can really understand what this experience looks like today. So would you both be down to sort of walk us through this?
A live demo?
A live demo.
Absolutely.
Let's do it. Deep, do you want to share?
Yeah, let me share my screen here.
Cool. Shreya, what site do you think we should build?
I was wondering, like, if we were to build docs, like automated docs for Auth0, I wonder what that would look like. So is that something that you'd be able to do?
Well, we love the Auth0 docs. I mean, I know that you guys build your docs in-house. It could be that down the line, there's a decision to not build the docs in-house, instead to buy a solution, right? That build versus buy analysis. Let's do it.
Awesome.
What would it look like for Fern to generate a documentation website for the Auth0 API?
So I see the first step is just going to the Auth0 docs, which is a great place to start.
Yeah, just taking a quick look at the Auth0 docs and like the dark mode and the styling here. It looks like the Auth0 docs have some like quick starts. And then there's also like a full API Explorer experience where you can click into each different resource here. And if this is probably an API endpoint. So yeah, I get the curl request, I get the endpoint itself, and I can do this across all the different endpoints that exist.
And then that set API token in the top right, what's that, Deep?
So looks like, I won't share too much here, but looks like I can basically pop an API token and start making requests.
Okay.
Awesome. So what I'll do is I'll, transition back to my IDE here. I have cursor up. I have an API.json file. This is, the Auth0 management API. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to try to just generate a simple doc site. And in order to do that, I'm going to first install the Fern tool chain. I'm basically going to run npm install Fern API. So I'm going to do a global installation, and this will grab the latest version of the Fern CLI and install it on my computer. Then I'm going to run a simple command Fern init, except I want to initialize it with my OpenAPI spec here, API.json. So I'm going to let Fern's going to ask me for my organization, extra relevant here. I'm just going to press enter, and we're going to be part of the Auth0 org.
And Deep, can we make the text size a little bit bigger?
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. Perfect.
So now what happened, in case you didn't catch it, was I had this Fern folder created. Right now, nothing so interesting. I'm just going to run a command Fern check and just make sure that the API is actually valid. And so it looks like there's 0 errors, a couple of warnings. For now, I'm just going to ignore the warnings and keep going as I build out the doc site.
Could I pause you here real quick, just out of curiosity? So this is the process of what an actual customer, an actual developer would be doing as well if they were building out their own documentation.
That's exactly right.
The part where it says, please enter your organization, is that something that's creating an organization, or would you have created an organization for the customer already?
Yep. So this is actually not creating an organization. This is just creating a reference to that organization.
Okay.
But when I go to actually generate the documentation, at that point, the organization will be created. And so, and especially, for example, if your GitHub email is exactly that domain matches, then you'll be added to that organization. So it's going to be pretty seamless. You're not even going to know how I just get added in this case.
Awesome. Thank you so much for explaining that.
So the next thing I'll do now that I have my Fern folder is I'm going to run another command. I want to initialize a doc site. And so this had this command right here, Fern init -- docs. This has created a docs configuration. I can open my Fern folder and I see a simple docs.yaml. Because my org was Auth0, we're going to host it at auth0.docs.buildwithfern.com. And right now, all my docs have is an API reference that's paginated. And so I'm going to run this command Fern docs dev, and this will start a local development server just so I can see what do my docs look like very plain. So we've just run 4 commands here in about 15 seconds, and now we have a local server running here. And boom, I can start to see some docs. So I can see all the different resources in the Auth0 API. I can click into different endpoints. I get the doc strings coming through. I can see the query parameters, the response, the errors, as well as like some basic curl examples of the API.
Now, Deep, you had referenced API.json. What is that file?
Great question. So I was going a little too fast, but this, is the Auth0 OpenAPI spec. And so this is actually quite important. The Fern toolchain is built on top of OpenAPI, which is the standard for documenting REST APIs. What are the inputs? What are the outputs? And so all the customers that come to Fern today, they usually come to us with an OpenAPI spec, and they're able to then plug that into all of Fern's tooling.
Deep, do you typically see people hand maintain this, or do they get it generated? Like, how do they get to OpenAPI?
Yep. So this is a great question, and I imagine that over the next few years, Fern will actually start helping people accomplish this objective. But for now, we see a pretty even divide here. We see a lot of people come to us that are actually maintaining the OpenAPI spec by hand. So I know it sounds ridiculous, but this spec is hundreds and hundreds of lines, thousands of lines, and we actually see developer teams like maintaining this by hand. Now, for the other 50%, we see them using server frameworks such as Fast API, Java Spring, Nest.js, and these server frameworks are designed to output an OpenAPI spec. The one downside is that these, you can only do so good with automation. And so a lot of the folks that auto-generate their OpenAPI spec have a lot of, have quality issues, and we'll actually help them improve their OpenAPI so that their docs look really great and their SDKs also feel really great.
If you want it fast, generate it from your server framework. If you want it best, handwrite it. Trade-off.
That's exactly right. So now that we have, we had this
sorry,
API
Deep,
spec.
was there some special access that you needed to get this OpenAPI specification file for Auth0? Like, where'd it come from?
Good question. I think that I might have actually needed some special access to get this because I couldn't find it on their docs. So I think I'm lucky in that respect.
Thank you, Shreya, for hooking us up.
But most people can probably find it on, a company's documentation page. A lot of folks will just link out to their OpenAPI, so it's really easy to download and get started.
Shout out to the startups program.
So at this point, just to recap again, I have my OpenAPI spec, I have my Fern documentation configuration, and I have a server that's running my local version of my docs. The next thing I want to do is I want to style this. I want to make this look ready to go. And then I actually want to publish the documentation website itself. So the Fern docs.yaml is very flexible. You can configure all the different types of colors. And I even downloaded a couple assets like some Auth0 fonts and logos ahead of the call, and you can customize those as well. So I'm actually going to take this assets folder. I'm going to pop it into my Fern folder here. And then I'm going to go grab like a colors configuration for my other IDE sitting right here. Not like I prepped this demo in advance or anything. But let me take
this is your baking show moment where you get to undo the oven and grab the docs.yaml configuration of colors and themes.
Exactly. So I'm just going to paste this. I'll let the local server reload and do its thing. And while it's doing that, I'll just quickly talk about what is here, right? So there's actually nothing sophisticated. I've just configured the logo. We can customize the height, set a fav icon, configured some of the different colors on the entire site, the background, and then also customize some of the fonts. And now if I go back to my, docs here, suddenly it looks a lot more like Auth0. We see the logo, we see the light mode and the dark mode, and the fonts are now reflecting what Auth0 uses in their actual website as well.
I really love the balance between something that's really, really automated and does all of the like labor for you, but then also having so much like the option to customize and be able to make things look exactly the way you want to.
Yeah,
Yep,
that's
it's like a
like one of
constant
the
engineering battle for us. Like, where do we put in opinions, but where do we allow people to override those opinions so that they can get to a website that feels great?
Yeah.
It's probably a similar challenge that Webflow and Squarespace and Wix have to balance. You want to make it really easy to use, but then really easy for someone to break the glass and do custom things. One of the examples is you can actually bring your own React components into Fern docs. So it's like, if we don't have the component you want, go write it yourself and import it.
That's awesome. Okay, that's really great.
So the last step I'll take here before actually publishing the website is I noticed that there were, different types of markdown guides or, more unstructured content in your doc site. So for now, I'll just add a single page just to show what it looks like to add markdown driven content in the Fern docs. And so what I'll do is I'll come into my navigation, I'll add a page, maybe I'll call it overview. And then maybe I'll create a little directory here in my Fern folder called pages. I'll create a file called overview.mdx. And then, because I'm in cursor, I'll ask it like, hey, give me an overview of the Auth0 management APIs and make sure to add a title and subtitle in the a little mistake here, in the front matter. And then we'll just see what it does, and like it's not going to be perfect, but it'll give me something, and then I can go back and refine that. So here we've added, this simple markdown guide. I'm not going to check it for accuracy right now and just cross my fingers. And then I'll reference this in my navigation. So I'll add pages and then overview.mdx. I'll save my file. I'll wait for the server to refresh. And then as it's reloading, we should now see there's an overview right here in the docs, right? And so now here, the AI has gone ahead and added an extra title. So I might come back and, take out this H1 right here and let it reload, and then we should see that disappear. But this is how someone might actually iterate on the docs and, make their content better and better.
Okay, slightly dumb question, but where is like the magic of the SDKs and the codes translating between different languages? Where does that happen?
Yeah, great question. So before I actually jump into where are the SDKs, where are the code samples, what we can do is we can actually generate an SDK and just check it out. Once we've generated the SDKs, we can go back to the doc site and see all the snippets updated themselves. So for the demo here, we actually set up a simple, GitHub organization. In this GitHub organization, we're going to go ahead and generate a TypeScript SDK. So I have a repository here, Auth0 node. It has absolutely nothing inside of it. And normally it would take a developer a long time to go in and implement such a huge SDK for the Auth0 API.
We're talking
And
hundreds of endpoints, right?
yeah, hundreds of endpoints, exactly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just X out of all the docs related stuff I was doing, and I'm going to pull up a file called generators.yaml. So generators.yaml is where you maintain your SDK generators and configure how they generate code with Fern. So here we can see that we have, we're using the TypeScript Node SDK. I'm going to rename the group here to make it a little bit, more clear what this group is doing. And then I'm going to actually configure the location and package name for the output of this SDK. And I also wanted to actually push to a GitHub repository, the one that we were just looking at. And I'm going to go ahead and copy over the org and the repository ID. Now, each of our generators.
This is a pretty popular pattern that, Deep, while you continue to generate, it's a pretty popular pattern that we'll see where someone wants to both publish the generated code to GitHub so that it's open source. They like that transparency that Auth0 has.
Yeah.
You can see the code, you can make contributions, you can open issues, but at the same time, they also want it available packaged up and on a registry like NPM or PyPy. And so one of the things that we've done for our customers is we handle that whole publishing pipeline because generating the code is just one piece of it.
Gotcha. So what you're doing right now is enabling them to do that, be able to have
Exactly.
those options.
We
Okay.
are specifying on line 11 that we want it to npm, and on line 14, specifically the GitHub repo. And Deep has pre-installed permissions for us to write to that repo.
Gotcha.
And by installing a GitHub app called Fern bot.
Okay. Gotcha.
So right now in the terminal, we see a bunch of logs. And what's happening is we are iterating over the OpenAPI specification. We're parsing it. And then we have a rule-based code generation system. So it's not LLMs to do this, but it's like when you see an endpoint or when you see a parameter name, we are specifying where that should go in the output SDK. And then right now in the debug, it said creating snippets, and those are the example usage of how to use that endpoint in that specific language, in this case, TypeScript, which is also JavaScript compatible. And the output that we want from here is we want to see a commit made on main of the GitHub repo, that Auth0 node, that demo repository. And then we also want to see it actually plumb through and publish to NPM as a package that a developer could go import into their project.
So yeah, so as Daniel was going through that explanation, the process here ended. I can click into the GitHub repo. I can see that, Fern bot or our GitHub app here has released 0.0.1. And if I actually click into the repo here, now it's no longer empty. It has all this code specific to Auth0. And so, there's a README that's generated. It's generated with some automatic code snippets. The entire SDK is typed. It has first-class exception handling. And it also comes with a file called reference.md, where you can actually see all the different methods that are there in the SDK. So for a developer who cares about actions and maybe deleting those actions, they can, toggle this on and see, hey, what does it look like for me to actually use the SDK? And what does it look like for me to actually, what are all the different types of methods that are here that I could potentially use in my application?
Gotcha. I have a couple questions. One of them is how do I, like, as a developer, how do I trust that all of this code is accurate and it works well? Is there any sort of like testing process that like I would need to go through to know that I can trust it?
Yeah, great question. So you can see here, there's a test folder right here. And so we do generate a bunch of different unit tests across the entire API to make sure that the SDK works. Beyond that, though, we have this file called Fern ignore. And what this does is it allows people to add additional code into the SDK for, whatever engineering requirements they might have. And so some of our customers are like, it doesn't matter how much you test the code, we need to test the code and we need to hit our own servers. And they can absolutely go in, add as many tests as they want, merge it in, and those tests will run as part of your deployment process.
Shreya, one of our customers is Intercom, the customer service tool. They had existing SDKs before they started using Fern. And one of the things that they asked of us is, can we make it so that their existing tests pass on the Fern SDKs as a way to validate that our code was functional?
Gotcha. And that works. They were able to pull in those same tests.
And actually, what we had to do is we had to go make some changes to the OpenAPI specification, and it helped us find some inaccuracies and something that was typed as an integer instead of a double, or something that was typed as a string instead of an enum with a strict set of values.
Gotcha.
But we got it to the point where the test passed, and then they feel good about migrating their SDK and releasing a new major version for their users.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because the worst thing you want is that you go through all of this process of migrating and then realize it's taking more time to test things out. So I love that you've made it super, super easy for everyone to be able to test and then also add their own tests in. What about like updates to these specs? Like you mentioned that you had to go back and update it. L- How do you use this with an API that is living and breathing and grows over time and changes a lot over time?
Yeah, great question. So it's pretty simple. In this folder in my IDE right here, I have, API.json. Whenever I change this API.json, I can just run the same command again, and a new commit will be pushed at a new version, and you can even control the version if you want. So if you look at the command that I ran to generate the SDK, it's quite simple. It's Fern generate the language and then the version. And so here, as you update the API.json, you can just keep rerunning this command, and immediately your users are going to get access to new pieces of functionality.
Gotcha.
Deep, what about the docs? Shreya had asked earlier, how do the docs and the SDKs relate? Because at Fern, we view them as like peanut butter and jelly. You can have them separately, but they're just better together.
So let me pull up the docs. So while we were generating, we also published the docs to a hosted URL. And so one right here, like as a developer, I don't have to worry about deploying a front end. I don't have to worry about deploying to S3. I can just immediately use Fern, do something locally, and now make it available on a hosted website that, any of us can hit. So, that same styling, dark mode, light mode is here. If I click into actions again, I click into get actions, we see that there's a curl snippet here, but now there's a drop down here.
Whoa.
I can hit type script, and now I can suddenly see, hey, this is how I actually use the SDK for this particular endpoint. And so that's true across all the different endpoints here. I could go to get actions, and now the API request, the SDK snippet has changed. And then more importantly, on our hosted version of docs, we have a try it functionality. So if we hit try it over here, this will pop open, this will pop open your API playground. For someone like Auth0, it's actually really important to be able to change this host here so you can point to your own tenant, and then you can enter your token and start making requests to the SDK.
Let's call it, Deep, if we had the Fern prod tenant, how would we change that URL?
That's right. So the URL is a little fuzzy, but let's pretend it was like fernprod.auth0.us.com. It might be something along those lines, but you would just be able to change the URL like that, pass in your own token, and then go ahead and make a request.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This demo was very easy to follow, which can be really difficult for developer demos, I think. You both did a fantastic job of explaining everything. I feel like I understand. But if anyone has any questions, please do let us know in the comments. I have a couple of questions still. So one of them, I like to think a lot about like psychology and how much stress developers take on a day-to-day basis building things out over and over again. I think we got to see this live, but could you talk a little bit about like how Fern and the use of these types of technologies can help reduce like the load, like the cognitive load on your mind when you're a developer in trying to like build these things out, but also having control over customizing your tools?
Absolutely. We talk about this. We have a couple of customers doing voice AI, one being 11 Labs, another a company called Cartesia, another called Hume AI, and DeepGram's another. And one of the things that's top of mind for us is they should go have an amazing model and Gen AI solution. They should not have to spend their time making their API reference picture perfect or making sure that their Python reads in a Pythonic manner. And so our goal is to let folks focus on their core product and the builders, the API producers, and offload the developer experience infrastructure. On the flip side, for the API consumer, our goal is that they can just focus on building their project and not having to spend too much time during the integration. Because you typically have on your mind, like, I'm looking to add users and organizations to my app. And I'm just trying to accomplish that quickly and get it done successfully, securely, and cost effectively, but I'm just trying to get it done. And so every minute that we can take away from troubleshooting and put towards building core product is us doing our jobs.
Yeah. And then do either of you have any advice for startup founders who are building developer first tools like Fern?
Yeah, I mean, we've learned this kind of the hard way. We've been at this for a while, but I do think it's really important to start with a narrow market and a narrow user. And so, for us, like everyone in the world has APIs, right? So it became actually quite challenging to figure out who is going to use this. And our first customer was someone from Palantir who had seen the internal tooling, who had left and wanted that same internal tooling. So our market was literally just X AWS and X Palantir folks who knew the tooling. And then over time, we've slowly, increased that market and gone after more folks. And so finding a small market and a very specific user kind of clarifies what you need to do. And so if you're building in dev tools, dev tools can be applicable to a large number of people. It's beneficial to really narrow that down and nail the user experience for those small users at the beginning.
I would add to that we have the concept of deployed engineering here at Fern, which means we will get in GitHub with our customers. We'll actually get access to their GitHub organization or repositories. We will make PRs helping them. Deep mentioned that he helps customers go live. We spend a lot of time with our customers in their code base. And I think that's a requirement for a dev tool like this. Eugenio did the same thing actually in the early days of Auth0. This Collison brothers did the same thing, and Y Combinator when they were launching Stripe. Like, you actually have to sit next to the user either over Zoom these days and Slack. We have over 250 Slack channels with different prospects or customers. And so it's if you're thinking about founding a dev tool, I would say getting hands-on with customers is a really good idea, even though it doesn't scale.
Yeah, I really appreciate that advice, and I know a lot of founders are going to resonate with that as well. Thank you both, Deep and Danny, so much for all of your expertise and sharing that demo with us. And thanks to everyone who's watching. Let us know if you have any questions, and cheers to an amazing episode. I hope y'all have your boba.
Oh, I'm
That's
down
like
for that.
part
Cheers
of
to an amazing episode.
Cheers. Awesome.
Thanks for
Bye.
having me.